The following podcast is sponsored by Basico. At Basico, we understand your needs and pain points. Our expertise in CFO services, legal, finance IT, and people and payroll helps drive your business forward by inspiring change and challenging norms. We believe in deep explorative discussions and critical angles, the same spirit that fuels the Only Constant podcast hosted by our own Lasse Rindom. Discover more about Basico's vision and services at basico.dk. And if you like what you hear in this episode, please don't hesitate to share it with a friend. And now Lasse, take it away.
You are listening to The Only Constant, a podcast where we go beyond the usual discussions in technology and business and aim to explore more than explain. Join me for engaging discussions with a diverse range of global thought leaders as we seek to uncover new perspectives and insights in a free-flowing conversation. My guest today is Peter Vester, and I am your host, Lasse Rindom. Hi Peter, and welcome to The Only Constant. I'm super happy to have you here today, and I've been looking forward to recording this episode with you since we spoke a couple of months ago over a coffee, I think, walking around the inner city in Copenhagen.
Well, thank you. I'm also very happy to be here and talk about some of the cool things we do in Novo Nordisk and all the stuff that's happening in the world right now.
There's a lot of stuff happening, right? And also at Novo Nordisk, I know, right? So it's really interesting to have you here. Peter, you in 2024, you won a DAIR Award for Data Science Professional of the Year. And the motivation behind your award was that you've demonstrated exceptional leadership and vision in advancing generative AI within the pharmaceutical industry. So that naturally means that I have to ask you a couple of interesting questions about this, right?
That makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. So, first of all, what are some of the new possibilities that generative AI opens up for enterprises?
Yeah, so it's not a secret that most enterprises are sitting on a lot of text data, and a lot of the stuff we do in our everyday work is we are writing stuff, we are trying to read stuff, to understand it, and so on. And of course, generative AI comes with this possibility of actually dealing with all this, this huge amount of unstructured data that we have lying around, and the dream is, that you have this. Everybody has this assistant that can help you with some of these tasks. So that's something that is new compared to traditional machine learning like prediction models and so on. This is something that really digs down into human created material and understanding it, and you're able to act on it and even produce it, right?
But does this also mean that what we're working with is not just we're working with a model, right? So that knows some things, right? So the creativity and the understanding, the unstructured stuff, there must be some gaps there as well, some things it doesn't understand.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's not a perfect model. It's it is a model, so it's all in the end of the day, it's about statistics. It's based on what has been trained on, and in general, the more creativity you want the model to show, the higher the chances that it will say something wrong. So there's always a trade-off there. I mean, do you want something that is always at the point correct, but very boring and non-creative, or do you want something creative that is sometimes going a little bit off the track? But I think it's actually the same thing you're dealing with employees. Do you want creative, innovative types that are also sometimes incorrect, or do you want the ones that just gets the business done but never do innovation?
But that's the sales pitch, right? But there's also the IT pitch, right? So this is also a system, right? So you would expect something different than you usually do with employees, right? Haven't you stumbled upon that in Novo?
Like, you mean with the whole GenAI?
Yeah, the thing is that you say now it's like an employee, but people will be like, no, it's not. It's an IT, it's a computer system, right?
It is a computer system. Of course, in some ways it could be, in some ways you can see it as an employee, but this is more like on an abstract level because it can do tasks that we normally have thought about humans doing, like rewriting stuff, understanding things, and so on. But of course, it is an IT system, right? And And because it's an IT system, then of course it might. We have all this problem with hallucinations and so on, and that's and also who is responsible and all that. Because if you have an assistant, there's always a human responsible at the end of the day if you say something incorrect and so on. If it's an IT system, then who is responsible if you act on something wrong?
So for data professional like you, isn't it difficult not to know how accurate it is?
It's difficult to know, because you never know when it's got to hallucinate. But most models, of course, has some kind of accuracy. And some things you can measure, like you can measure, for example, you can come with 100 example questions and see how often is it correct, right, within in a certain area, right? But it is, of course, a little bit different than traditional machine learning in that sense. That it is a little bit, because even if you come with 100 example questions, then the question you're going to ask it is probably going to be a little bit different from the ones you have benchmarked.
Yeah, but also the thing you said before, that you can ask it to do creative stuff, right? But can you also ask it not to do creative stuff? So I've obviously spoken about this on the podcast before, right? The hallucination is not a bug thing, but isn't that one of the key problems sometimes when you're working with it in enterprise processes, that you can't ask it not to hallucinate?
Yeah, there are certain things you can adjust to make it less prone to hallucination, right? But that is the main problem with GenAI nowadays, because it's a beautiful thing. It can read through all the documentation. It can create documents. Especially in pharma, a lot of the things we do is to create documents for different kind of audiences. If you can just create all that for you, you can just focus on the science part, right? And that's the dream. But then the problem is always but it's only accurate in 90% of the cases. And then how do you deal with that? And then, of course, you can say you can just get a human to review it. But then we also know, if a human review stuff, you are less likely to find errors than if you produce it yourself. Automation bias, you feel that it's okay if you get it suggested. Exactly. And sometimes it gets worse the better the model becomes. Because, even as a human, if a new intern comes with a report to me, I will check it very carefully, right? If a more experienced employee comes with a report, I will just, it looks fine, because I trust that normally it's good. Yeah. It's the same thing with AI. So sometimes it can even be a problem when it becomes better, because then we are less critical for the output. That's interesting. Because if it's only correct 50% of the times, then you know that you have to check everything very carefully. But isn't that also? I feel like. I feel there is and I think Robert Fuchs said it on the podcast a couple of episodes back, that we should use automation. He builds steering systems for Toyota and car manufacturers. He says that we should first use technology and autonomous technology to root out the human error first, and then start doing its own stuff. Yes. And what you're saying is building this documentation is actually asking the model to create stuff for you. So create the documentation. And that's the thing, because I think the whole creation part is maybe something that comes a little bit later, because the most safe area... But it's generative, Peter, it's generative, right? Yeah. So that's the dream, right? It showed us we could just do this, right? Yeah, but I think it's especially if you work in an area with a lot of rules, regulatory rules and so on, I think it's important to start with the right use cases first, maybe the more low-risk use cases. And you can say, the lowest risk use cases is to take some documentation that already exists and then double check if it actually followed the requirements. Yeah, root out the human error. Exactly. So you take something that we already produced and so on, because humans also have an error rate that we sometimes forget in this discussion. Sometimes in these discussions, it sounds like that humans never do mistakes, and this is... No, but I usually would say systems should help us do less mistakes, right? Exactly. That's a key. And be more productive is also a thing, but the rooting out of mistakes is just as big thing. That's of course the first step, right? This, even if it's wrong, it doesn't really matter, because it's just telling you these 10 parts of the documents already written seems to be in violation of some other documents, and the human can just go and say, okay, that's true or not true, right? Then, of course, the next step is then to use generative AI as an advisor. So that can see when you write a piece of documentation, then instead of trying to find the right information in a database of 10,000 documents, you can maybe use some of these RAG systems to find the right answer. And then, of course, you need to be very careful that you have transparency and you always go to the source and all that. And there's also, of course, a journey there in educating the people. And then, of course, when these things are working, that's where you can try to generate stuff, but that is more the high risk use cases of GenAI.
So
because of the bias of humans, right?
But I think actually what you just said there is like super interesting. So the generation of generative AI is the high risk area of generative AI.
Exactly. Yep. I mean, because we can use generative models in a way that is in many ways not generative, but that's actually the more low risk areas. And then the actual real generative AI, that's the high risk area, because you're actually generating human context, right? Or human-like context.
So is a chatbot a generative solution or a different solution? What do you think?
A chatbot?
Just, everyone's building chatbots, right?
Well, I mean, a chatbot is a generative solution because you can ask a chatbot to create a report for you.
But it also exactly. So what did you build at Novo to show exceptional leadership and vision in advancing generative AI?
Yeah, so exactly. It's always you always pick these very fancy words, right? But I mean, what we did, I mean, so back in the days, we go back to November 2022, and OpenAI did get this great idea to do probably the biggest human experiment in the world, to see like how does the world react to a good language model, and they just put it out there and then see what happens. And then they got 1 million users in no time, and all the companies wanted to use it. And then there was all these cases, like for example Samsung, they found out that people just put in like confidential codes and stuff like that, and they were like, okay, maybe we should plug it and do stuff. So there was a lot of chaos, and all the companies were like trying to figure out how to deal with this new technology. What should we do, right? And that's why we very early on in the beginning of 2023, we started to look into. The first step was like, okay, how do we create value from this? The first step is to allow all the employees to use the language model in a safe and compliant way. And that was where, we started talking with Microsoft, and then suddenly there was the Microsoft collaboration with OpenAI, and you could use the models through the Microsoft agreement. That's why we made our own internal chatbot that got 30,000 users within a year or so.
That's almost a ChatGPT level, right?
Not always, but I mean, it's basically,
yeah.
But it's that's it. And then, of course, I mean, on top of that, you could integrate it with some of our internal databases, like for training material and all that, kind of the standard stuff. And then that was the first layer. I was like, okay, let's just give this to the employees in a safe and compliant way. The second layer we then added on top was let's help the organization to build these tools in a better way. So that's why we made what we call the AI marketplace, which is basically in part of it is just an API layer where you have access to all the underlying models like Azure OpenAI, Google Gemini, all that, but through one common API structure. And then also a lot of blueprints and so on, so people could get inspired how to build stuff, so we don't duplicate efforts and all that. So that was kind of for the developers. And then thirdly, we started to look into more domain-specific issues. So part of it was to build, for example, chatbots for development or research. But part of it was also to look into, for example, what about proteins, for example? Proteins is a sequence of amino acids. And that means that there are also generative models out there for that purpose, because a sequence of amino acids follow some of the same rules as a sentence, natural language sentence. And then you could actually start predicting,
so
properties.
you can speak amino, is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So you have because you have a sentence, and the sentence has a certain meaning, right? It's the same, you have a sequence of amino acids in a protein, and that has a specific meaning. And there are some rules, there is in a way like a short-term memory, long-term memory, if you look at the sequence and all that. So that's actually super interesting. So this is one of the more domain-specific things where we actually can start using generative AI in drug discovery and all these things.
So that's where you're building your own
three
model.
Layers,
and you're involved with the Gefion project, or?
Yes, I mean the Gefion supercomputer is of course that's the Novo Nordisk Foundation, right? But we are of course a big user of that technology. We are not using that at this point, but the plan is to use it for especially research purposes.
Because you're both using the generative AI models, that language models as usual, but you're also building your own foundation models on protein language.
Yeah, I mean, so there are different ways you can build foundational models, right? And also different definitions of it, right? Because what we do is either we build our own, or we take something out there and then we fine-tune it for our own purpose. So that could, for example, take... I mean, if you talk about protein models, there's like ESM2, ESM3 out there that you can fine-tune like our own internal information. And then option 2 is then to build your own model from scratch. And you, at the end of the day, you use what works the best. So so that's basically it. So that's the 3 layers. I mean, we want to bring GenAI to everyone. We want to help the developers make solutions, and then we want to make these more bespoke solutions. Whereas in principle, have 2 layers. There's more the simple one, like chatbots for like different domains, and then of course there is like GenAI models on a more abstract level, for example.
But all of these cases are related to generating things, aren't they?
Yes, exactly.
So you take all the difficult stuff, Peter. You haven't done any of the simple, AI workflow stuff.
What do you mean by simple AI?
No, I'm not saying simple, but basically where AI comes in and it sort of understands an input and then it just structures it or reviews it and moves on, as part of an automation workflow or something like that.
So that layer I talked about, where you made, for example, different chatbots for the organization. That can also be, for example, can you please read through these 1,000 documents, and here are the requirements to the documents, and can you then find out which documents are in violation of those requirements? That's, for example, also a common use case. That is, as we just talked about, the low-risk use cases where you just double-check and make sure that what you have already written actually is in agreement with.
Are you doing that as well?
Yes. Okay. And of course, it's not me, like as a person doing everything, right? We started this, as I said, back in the beginning of 2023. And the beginning was me and a colleague setting up the internal chatbot and so on. And then, of course, the more success we had, the more people we got to join the area. So now we are a whole bunch of people working both with our internal tools like the marketplace, the chatbot, also going out in the organization, trying to solve some of these specific, like domain-specific problems. And then, now it's me basically involved with people in research as well around protein models, for example.
So that's what you do. So, but you have a whole team now doing all this.
Yeah, now there's a whole team so doing that. So
following an AI strategy, or is it still more explorative, or how is it?
Yeah, maybe we are following a strategy. So when we started out in the beginning, we were just doing use cases more or less randomly, because we just wanted to see what is this technology actually able to do, get some experience and so on. But then, especially the last year or so, we have moved on from that, from just doing random use cases across the organization. So now we want each of the areas to basically come out, okay, what are actually the top 3-4 use cases that will do a difference for the company. And we also try to move away from a technology-based way of doing use cases and actually focus on the actual business problems.
Yeah. So it sounds like they're saying, what are the biggest issues? And so instead of saying, what could we do? And then saying, what is the problems we need to solve?
Because one of the big problems with GenAI is that it's so popular and people want it. And every area or department wants the GenAI solution. Because you look at the technology and they say like, okay, how can that technology help us? And what we are doing now is we have this whole now AI accelerator kind of framework where we want to go to line of business and then say, let's forget about GenAI for a moment. Yeah. Let's just look at what are your core processes, what are the problems with those processes, and what can we do to address those problems.
So using AI as a beacon. For digital solutions, right?
Exactly right, because we want to see what are actually your main problems, where are the main areas you spend time, and what is the issues, and then what can we then use to solve those issues. And sometimes that is automation, sometimes that is more traditional machine learning, sometimes it's just a change of a process. Yeah. Sometimes it's GenAI sometimes, right? Yeah. But we just want to make sure that we force the line of business to think about what are the problems, what are the things that actually bring significant business value, that makes us better in competing with our competitors. And then from there, we then find out what is the needed to do that. But on top of that, we also wanted to think about what are all the roles they have in the department, and how do they expect that role to change over time. Which means that we can, of course, tie all that down to the IDPs, in the individual development plans, so we can actually also make sure that we upscale the employees as well. but based on also what the department themselves actually think will change in their profession.
So it's more like a transformational office than an AI office.
Yeah, so that part is more like that, finding out what are the actual business needs. And then based on the technology that we just come up in the end will help, then we can send it, for example, to automation team or GenAI team.
But isn't something like this, right, where you look at the concrete problem from an AI perspective, from a generative AI perspective, going back to what we started with, talking about it's difficult to measure, the quality of the output and stop the hallucination. Isn't it difficult then to say, because most of the problems like that would have some kind of KPI attached to it. So you say, I usually say in enterprises that nothing flies without KPIs. So where you were playing in the beginning with a new model that could do things, now suddenly you are sitting in situations where you're solving problems with real enterprise key performance indicators. And that also means that you have to have even more reliability in the model and the output that they're producing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that comes...
Is that slowing it down or accelerating it?
I would say it's slowing it down before it can accelerate. So I give you a tricky answer to that because of course, in the end of the day, if you want people to adopt the tools we are creating, they need to know as well, what is the accuracy is actually performing well? Is it 50%, 80%, 90%, transparency and so on? If they don't have those things in place, they will maybe play with it for a while, but then they will not use it eventually, right? So that's what I mean by first we need to slow down. We will be like, okay, like any other machine learning project out there, we need to sit down with the stakeholders and define, what is acceptance criteria, for example, right? If we make a tool like, it doesn't matter if it's a prediction model, if it's a new, like if it's a whatever XGBoost or if it's a GenAI model, what is the accuracy that we need to have for it to be useful? And what is the transparency we need to have in place, right, to make sure that we can actually double check the results and so on. And then you can say, like, okay, how do you even define accuracy for a large language model, right? But there are ways to do that.
Yeah, of course there are, and testing as well. Yeah.
Exactly, right. And that will, of course, slow things down because you then need to make a framework for that. You need to have test data. You need to do all that, quote, boring stuff that has to be in place. Do you do more
testing with these models than you would do with other solutions?
It's a different kind of testing, I would say, because if you have labeled data, for example, then it's very easy to split into test, validation data set and trained data set, right? When it comes to GenAI, then you need to create your testing data sets. You need to come up with questions, acceptable answers, acceptable references, and then check if it's correct, right?
It's almost like building UX now.
Yes, exactly right. And then, of course, that takes time as well to create this. Secondly, how do you make sure that you actually cover all your feature space?
It is this unlimited capabilities means unlimited testing. I
exactly say. Because you cannot do unlimited testing, right? No. And can you cover all possible questions that people might ask the system?
I remember I spoke to someone from pharma about with RPA, where he said that we have to go through test, dev test prod, right? And when we came to test, we always said, okay, now it's good to go to prod. Okay, but to go to prod with an RPA tool, you had to change some of the objects to go into production system, and then you had to go back to test again. So they were stuck in that eternal test loop. You don't have that.
So, but he went from to test, and they found out that everything was working fine.
Yeah, but the test was on the test system, so it was automating on top of the test SAP or something like that, right? And then when they had to go to prod, you have to change some of the objects because RPA touches upon specific objects that are different when you're in a production environment. It's an interface, right?
Ah, yeah, okay.
It's automating the interface, and then you have to go back to test again because now you changed it. So.
Yeah, that can happen sometimes. And also, especially when new technology is like this, you can make your test frameworks and all that, but you're also very depending on the user feedback because the way you test it might be very different from what the users actually input in the system because it can be very hard to predict sometimes how people are going to use it because when you have a prediction model, right, when people can just, put in a brand and a year and then you can make a prediction, right? But if you have a more like large language model based algorithm, then people can write free text, right? And sometimes it can screw up an algorithm because people write thank you in the end or something like that.
Yeah.
And there's also weird stuff that can, and they even found out, that you get different answers even if you are asking in a polite way, impolite way.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? It's a semantic model. People forget that it's a semantic model. It's not code. And I remember, I think I spoke about that on another episode as well. I don't know if I did, but a couple of weeks ago we had this scenario where I wanted it to not use a specific field in my SQL. So it wrote SQL for me to grab some data, and it would do not use this field. I said, do not use description, but do not fuzzy search. Just don't do it. And I kept on writing it, and the prompt and trying to not have it do that, but it kept on doing it anyway. So in the end I said, if you use the description field, you'll go to jail, ! And then it didn't do it.
Yes.
So I threatened a language model with jail time.
Yeah, and we are in many ways still trying to understand why our large language model working the way they are.
Yeah.
Because in a way it makes sense. If you think of it as in a very simplified way, it is kind of a next word predictor. I know that it's not exactly like that, but you can think about it like this, right? So that means like, even naively, you could think about, okay, for example, if I write it in a very polite way, maybe it's more, I have a bigger tendency to look at like whatever professional content like articles and so on. If I write in a very angry way, then maybe it's looking more at like forums that is very opinionated.
Yeah, one of my key, I always show that. I think Thomas Hildebrand, he posted a year or something ago a riddle for language models that they never fix, except when they have reasoning on. Right, so raw language model never fixed this one. So it's that he has a boat with room for an animal and a person. And I'm making an optimal plan for getting me and my dog across the river. Mm-hmm. And then it makes weird steps, like tons of steps. The dog rows across, you row back and forth, and it goes like that. Because the language sounds like a riddle. So even though the answer is super simple, it answers it like a riddle. Because you activated some feature in it that you didn't know you activated.
Wow, that's so
there's semantic stuff going on that we don't really know. You're activating something. You should try that prompt out. It's really weird, actually.
That's cool. Yeah. And there's a lot of interesting stuff about language models, and of course there's also the whole bias thing that we haven't really talked about, especially when you generate stuff, right? Yeah. Because of course there is the classical, gender bias and so on, but there's also a lot of other biases that maybe people don't think too much about, because whoever makes the models, it doesn't matter who it is. It's of course the requirements they put to the models, what they say is acceptable, not acceptable, that depends on the culture it's created in.
Yeah.
So that's why we see, for example, models created in the US or in China are very different. And they are both in some ways trying to impose the worldview of
we're realizing
of the
that
culture.
Language is actually quite important for humans, right?
Exactly right. So if we start using these models to generate content, we are automatically imposing the worldview from the culture or the model is created into our own culture, and then we can think about if that's what we want to do.
So I wanted to ask you what comes next, right? But I also want to ask you on that note, what constraints does working with AI then in a highly regulated industry put on the use cases? Where's the hard line for you?
So
why can't you put American biases to work?
Yeah, but also,
also Chinese biases or French or whatever.
These kind of biases also depends on the use case, right? Sometimes it doesn't matter if there's a political bias because you're not writing anything that could be interpreted in a political way, right? But sometimes it's an issue. So, of course, one of the problems is, okay, we have this big language model and you have to send your data back and forth to some kind of provider, right? And especially if you work with super confidential data, then you're not always happy about that. But of course, that can be solved by having a restricted environment. You can even just run models locally and do that. So that's from a tech side that we can make these things very secure and make sure that no data leaves our systems and so on. But there are more dimensions to the problem than that, right? Because that is just like from a purely data side of things. We are not leaking data out, right? But then the second part is then how do people then utilize the data, right? Are they just copy pasting whatever it comes with and sending it to the authorities? So that's of course the human part of it, where you can try it with education to kind of expand the areas where we can use it. But of course, there is especially in a company like Novo, whenever we send stuff to authorities and so on, it's just super important that we are not sending wrong information.
Yeah.
So, and we already talked a little bit about it, even if you're just advising and so on, but if you see something that looks correct, then you're biased to accept it and not being as critical to the content, and then we end up sending information that is wrong, and then who's then responsible for it if the authorities come and say like, well, you were lying about A, B, and C. Then can you point to a human or can you point to a machine? And if you point to a machine, what does that even mean?
Yeah, well, you're actually pointing to kill that server. We should have scaffolds for
of course,
machines.
it's important that you have people that are responsible.
That's what Robert Fuchs again said. He said that when you have very complex systems that no one can really understand how they work or what they did, you end up blaming the human. Always. He calls it the human crumple zone, like in a car, when you crash, you have the crumple zone in front, but suddenly the human becomes the crumple zone to protect the system.
Yeah. Yeah, in many ways you could say so. So that is...
But also most of the processes in pharmaceutical industries are very strict, right? You have to follow in production, you have to do things the same way, right? Because they've been approved that way. How do you can you insert a stochastic parrot AI model into things like that? Yeah,
and that's of course an field that is still developing, right? Because of course, if you just have an algorithm that search and ask questions based on previous submitted data, for example, but you're not actually generating directly things that goes into a workflow. You're just helping the user to find the right documents to look into and so on. It is still part of the process, but it's not producing stuff that goes into a process, if it makes sense. So that's in a way more safe, because then you have that human that have to make a conscious decision to actually take the output and put it in.
So you're putting the human in that crumple zone.
Exactly. Because we're not there yet, but we can just have...
So you'll tell the human, you have to work faster now, because now you have AI. But you have to have responsibility for all the fast...
And that is, of course, always how it is. The more demand you put on people, the higher the chances they will do mistakes. Right? But of course, we're not there yet where we just, auto-generate stuff directly into a workflow. There we are not yet. And I don't know when we will get there, or if we will get there. But that's...
No, but that's I wanted to ask you, what will it take to get there?
So
I think people would be interesting to hear. Right?
Yeah, and I mean, this field is moving, right? For example, we just say, let's just take image analysis. Some years ago, we developed an algorithm that was looking at insulin pens, on the production line to see like if there was cracks in the pen, if the top was put properly and all that. And then we actually got the medical authorities in Denmark to approve that as the first kind of deep learning image analysis model in a big pharma production system, right? Which of course was a huge step forward, because that means that we could actually start using like deep learning methods in a pharma kind of regulated process, right? So that's of course an example of, yes, I mean, over time we will be allowed to do more and more things the more technology is being tested. But a little bit more
baby steps than what the market is talking about, or...
Exactly right. So there was of course image analysis, and this is a few years ago, and then we can say how many years have image analysis been around, and deep learning models, right? And then with GenAI, right, then we will need to take baby steps, right? And as we already talked about, the first step is to increase quality, but doing extra controls. It's easy enough to argue that, okay, we put this GenAI in here, and it's not changing anything. It's just letting you know if there's something that looks incorrect. Okay, that you can do. That's not a problem. Then, of course, as you said, like what we are doing now, we build these systems where people can look up stuff in previous submissions, and you get pointed to an exact document that you can read into. And there we sometimes have to restrict the models. Sometimes we actually have to tell the model, only answer with a reference and nothing else, right?
But it's like this, I always say that you need to build AI models and make the solutions you use them for, or also the chatbots you build, right, purposefully inhibited, right? It's like saying, it's easy to get a dog. You just, 10 times you just get a wolf, right?
Yeah.
But then you probably want to tame it and train it, right?
And that's
the raw wolf is.
Yeah, so sometimes you can do that, right? Of course, you can force it. For example, every time it comes with a statement, you actually have to give a direct reference, and you can even ask it to do a direct reference with a citation, right? And things like. And the beautiful thing about that, you can actually double check if the citation exists in the actual document, right? So there you can, of course, do some things. To make sure,
if you do that.
And if you structure the output to be like, okay, the only way you can answer is in quotes from the text, then of course you get a little bit closer to something that is correct.
Yeah, but
right?
it does. I always, after my episodes here, I always quickly post a post about that we did the recording, right? So I always give them the full transcript of the conversation, and I say, find the 10 best verbatim quotes, right? And then it often gives me something that is stylized, right? And I'm like, no, verbatim, right? Give me the exact words Peter used. And it's like, it doesn't really want to do that, right? It's like, but it's so annoying. Peter said it in a weird way. I'd rather say it this way.
Yeah.
It's like...
But there, this thing you can actually check. You just you can basically just see like that the quote that actually comes with, do they actually exist word by word in the?
You can double check
and
that
then
way.
you can, of course, if it comes with a quote that doesn't exist the exact same way, then you can, of course, redo it or whatever. Just make sure that
you're just hovering around this whole. You need to, of course, systems can test that particular case, but you always have to have this human need to test it, right? I think someone wrote the other day also that I'm super impressed. It created all the code and it created all the documentation, and it was just wild what it did, right? Perfect system. And someone asked him then in the comments, but did you check that the documentation fit everything in the code, and that the code does exactly what it did you actually test it yet?
Yeah.
No, because that would take him a couple of days to do as well, right?
Yeah. So, well, that's the problem with the human laziness, right? We, if it looks correct, then we just take it and we're like, all right, I could spend 2 hours actually double checking and writing tests and all that and making sure that it works, but well.
It's like my wife says, me doing the kitchen. I always leave a couple of things I didn't do.
And then often you do lazy testing. You're like, test it in 2 different cases. And it looks correct in both. And then you assume that it's just covering everything in between.
So how are you working with that? How are you dealing with that? Do you have just raw test managers doing everything, and then people who love just checking things? Or what do you do, Peter?
For me, or?
You're lazy too, aren't you? I assume you are building automation solutions.
Yeah. So you mean in the coding aspect? Or?
Yeah. When you're building a solution for something in Novo, what do you actually do to avoid just saying, "Oh, it looks good. It did 3 nice for me. We can move on." What happens?
So of course, there are different stages of a project. There is like the experimentation phase where you want something quick and so on. And of course, like everybody else, you use ChatGPT for some of the code and then of course you need to make sure that what it's actually coming out with is actually working, right? And this is where you need to be more critical and so on. And of course, when you take a step further, you, like every other piece of software, you need to make proper testing to say like, okay, this function that I created, are it actually giving the correct answer in a few different cases, including edge cases and so on. And so that's how we find out in traditional software development if your functions are behaving correctly, right, is to make proper testing. And you can say the more automation you're doing in the code itself, the more proper testing you need to do.
Oh, that is the unpleasant truth, I think, for 2025.
Yeah, and then of course, then you have, exactly right. And so I actually think that's one of the areas that we have to double click a lot more in the future, where more and more code will be generated by AI. It's like, then we need to increase and do more proper testing of everything.
So maybe this episode should be, I don't know, AI and inconvenient truths or something like that. We could do that.
Well, obviously you can do the testing with AI as well, but that kind of destroys the purpose of it, right?
Can you repeat that? No, you don't have to, but I think that is also a very important point. I think
my point is, you wouldn't need to have the human somewhere in the loop, right? Either you have a human to write the proper testing, but if the AI also makes the testing, then you just then the question is if it would even help, right?
But also, if you don't understand necessarily what's going on because you're a developer and you don't understand the business process, you still have that gap. Or if you're the business person just vibe coding, citizen developer style, then do you even know what happens then with version controlling and what happens on the other side? You know, the whole application side, right? We work in domains for a reason, right? But for some, with AI, it seems to be like, no, domains don't exist because AIs are cross-domain. They understand everything, right?
Yeah.
But they have attention. That's what they work on. You know, attention is what you need, but also what limits them, right?
Yeah. One of my big concerns is actually we see a lot of companies, of course, letting go of a lot of software engineers because they believe that a lot of the stuff can be automated. And my concern is like, but that will probably hurt us at some point, like because we need to make sure we are building proper systems, right? Because you can make a system that works, right? But is it easy to maintain? What if there is a problem at some point in the code? I mean, who's going to fix it?
I said,
who's going to understand the code? Because if you just get AI to generate everything, who sits with the whole end-to-end understanding of the code and what it does? And then you end up with, I foresee a lot of problems there.
So is AI the best it could be right now? Because right now we are skilled enough to debug it.
Now, do you mean that we over time become less skilled in it? I'll not say it's but I mean, of course, if we're gonna go down that path where we are just removing technical people, and then we are like, I think there even been some, who was it? Was it Jensen from like NVIDIA who went out and said like, we don't need developers anymore. And then it's like, okay, but then there's also no one that actually understands technology that can be critical, and then you very easily end down a wrong track where when the systems fails, no one can actually find out why.
Exactly. That's the problem, right? But that's in everything, right? If we de-skill ourselves enough with this, right? That's the biggest worry, I think, on a global level from these models, right? But I just love what you said previously, that we're starting to treat this, like any machine learning model. You said that, I think it was a quote, right? Because I think people are like, need to wake up and smell that coffee. because the other way is, more vibe coding, more speed. But what you're saying is that, no, but we have to go back again and say, no, but we have to take the tedium steps, the more testing, so the fun part of building the machine learning model back then has been automated to be very much faster with these AI models. Yeah. But the tedious part has become much bigger than it used to be with the machine learning models, right? That's also something you've said, isn't it? Or
exactly, and also...
so developing is just more boring today.
Exactly right, and that's also one of my concerns, because, I mean, I am a fan of the kind of citizen AI concept, that you make AI accessible to people and so on. But what I sometimes see is that people are starting to believe like, we don't actually need to have a data science background to do AI systems, right? Because it's so easy nowadays. You just drag and drop whatever boxes and then connects everything, and that's it. And this is where I think things start becoming very dangerous. Because also, I mean, you don't need a lot of data science expertise to do an XGBoost model. I mean, that's quite simple. You just put in the data, you have a model, you import it, and you use it, right? But what you actually need your data science background for is all the boring stuff around it, is to like understand the data, testing, evaluating it, all that.
No, all the usual fault lines, right?
All the boring stuff that you need to make sure that your system is behaving as it should in all different kind of cases, that you cannot just do as a citizen AI developer.
No.
You can make the system, but all the stuff around it, that's what requires, the actual data science domain knowledge, understanding data, the whole experience with working with this kind of problem for many years. So that's my concern sometimes when I see a lot of people building their own small solutions everywhere and chatbots and so on.
So it's more degradation issue.
Yeah, because everybody can build systems, right? But few people can build systems properly in a well-tested, well-defined way.
There's also this weird thing, right? That the people say that cloud is someone else's server, low code is someone else's code. So is AI someone else's data?
Well, I mean, it is, because when you think about a model, I mean, it's the only input to create a model is existing data, right? So it comes from somewhere.
Yeah, and then at some point you don't have, or at some point something new. I'm always curious about this, the novelty of it, right? Now we talked about all this, the degradation stuff, but I'm also, are we generating new, or are we just using up, the bulk of human knowledge we've created so far, and now we're just exploiting that and
Yeah, and this is an interesting concept, because it also sometimes GenAI also touches upon what is actually that makes us human, right? Because all our old definitions we have to redefine, because we always used to say like, oh, if you can generate content and so on, that's like a human task. That what makes us human. But now AI can do that, so now we need to redefine what does it mean to be human. What is it actually that makes us different from a large language model?
But also, what if someone came up tomorrow with a more efficient coding language, but AI would not be able to work it because there's no historical data to it?
Exactly, but then it could maybe understand it based on other programming languages and then make some assumptions. But you are right. I mean, it needs to be fed the data, right? But then it's also because right now, I don't know if you know about the Google co-scientist.
No, I know, I haven't heard about that one. No,
it's basically an AI model that you have a research question.
There's a lot of things.
Yeah, and then it comes up with a lot of hypotheses. It tests them and so on, and you can sometimes come up with novel ideas, because you can have agents from different domains and you can talk to each other, and then you can basically transfer some learnings from whatever biology into, for example, IT. And that's actually what a lot of research actually does. We try to take some concepts from one domain and then utilize it in another domain, and then you can get some good results from that, right? So that GenAI model could do.
So that's the creativity.
Yeah, because they can kind of, be specialists in different domains, and then they can transfer learn, concepts from one research field to another research field. So that we can see that it can already start doing. But then, of course, and a lot of novelty is actually taking something from one field and then applying it in a new field. But then, of course, there's also those things that are completely new, like completely novel, and it's like, could we get there with AI? That's a good question.
I think one of the very close to home examples of that, the last thing you said, is everyone in the world have tried asking generative AI what is the best use case for generative AI 2 years ago, where they had no data for using generative AI, so they only came up with classical machine learning ideas. Right? Have you tried that? Asking what are the good use cases for using generative AI in this domain?
And it didn't come up with anything.
No, but it came up with a lot of classic machine learning stuff, right? Because it didn't understand itself.
Exactly, right? So the more we feed it, the more it knows, right? But maybe at some point we're not gonna feed it anymore, only with stuff that it creates itself.
I've also said, and let's just take this. The right now the reasoning models are out there, right? And people are very impressed, and I'm also impressed. O3, they're really good, right? And they can give you extraordinary answers. But sometimes I feel they can also be extremely bad at just doing a simple task for me, because they can go on, detours, right? And they do that. People see this as something that will be, the autonomous engine of the future in some way, right? But what will it take actually to give something like O3, a reasoning model, full access to write APIs and some of your critical applications?
Like, you mean full access to write code and execute it itself?
Yeah, just have fun, just do everything. The full future, this is, it's the sci-fi pipe dream.
Yeah. And this is because nowadays, even with agents, right? I mean, then we also...
Are you building agents, by the way?
Well,
really? Are you just, really? Are you building agents really that does things on their own?
It depends what you define an agent as. For me, an agent is just a defined component does something. Like, for example, it can be a prediction. A prediction model can also be an agent, right?
No, but an agent is something that can act on its own in a defined environment and take different actions that could be, not necessarily mapped out.
So it depends actually what you mean, because, for example, an agent could be something that can just, it can take an input like a protein name, and it can output something else.
Yeah, that's not an agent, in my opinion. That's just, an AI model doing things.
So that depends how you define agent, because many people would say that's an agent, right? Because what's happening when we talk about agents is like that we have realized that if you make them too broad, then they don't function very well. So we need to make them very specific. So we basically need to make them Python functions in a way. Where you have very specific input and very specific output.
But then you chain that together and you ask a reasoning model on top of them to use all of those
and
as
then
tools.
You basically just give them, it's like, you say like, these are your available whatever Python functions, right? And these are your language. Try from that input text to find the right ones, find the right input, and then conclude on the output.
Or you own that entire process, and someone could start it at the end or the beginning or the middle.
Yeah.
What do you want to do, right? You have these tools available. That is the agentry.
That's the one. But I mean, and what we're doing now is we want to restrict them as much as possible, also from a security point of view and other things, because we don't want them to go rogue and do something that you're not supposed to.
And that's what my question was getting at, right?
Yeah. So now.
So when?
When
do you get an R2D2 who just control the place chip R2D2?
And this is the whole thing about slowing down before you can start accelerating, is because we need to do this to make sure that we are in full control, that we know what's happening and so on, and then we can start building proper testing, monitoring, all that, and then we can see how good can we do that. And then we can increasingly give them more and more freedom and authority about what they can do and not do.
But I think this is so interesting, because the whole, this is just a car replacing the horse cart, right? And that's quite fast. It takes some time, right? But it's also quite fast because you just replace one thing with another, right? But at the same time, AI has been faster than that, because everyone just got it on their phone, right? The chat interface, the personal productivity chat interface, right? But now we're talking about getting it into being productive. You're talking about, but everyone has it, knows it, but now we're slowing it down. We're slowing it a lot down, because we're controlling each and every single function. And then maybe we can add layers to that. But this is something that takes years, right?
Yes. And this is also what is new, right? Because if you go back to whatever...
And isn't that a winter? Isn't that an AI winter?
Like, what do you call a winter? Like,
that's where and people get disillusioned, right? Being like, "Oh, this is so slow."
Yeah, but that's what we need to accept. I mean, you cannot just move fast all the time, and also because technology is moving so fast. Right, back in the days when when a new field came up, whatever, handwriting recognition, it would take like 10, 15 years for it to reach human performance. Right, so there was plenty of time to build proper systems and even regulations and law and all that around it. Nowadays, we just see emerging fields, in some cases, outperforming humans like very, very quickly, right? And that means that we don't even have time to think about we build the systems. Technology just evolving so fast. So that's why we sometimes have to slow down and say, like, we have this new technology, we need to super restrict it, and then do all the careful work in finding out, how do we make sure that it behaves properly and so on, and then take it step by step, and then...
How do you balance that when you go to these departments who are like, they've been to AI conferences and like, oh, let's just go crazy. And then Peter comes along and he's like, have to go slow, and maybe you just need, how do you balance that? How do you balance the enthusiasm you're getting? You say everyone wants to do things, right? So you can't go around saying to everyone, this will take 5 years, but then we'll have something that works for you.
Well, you can. Well, so first of all, every time that people come and ask me if they can do a GenAI solution, I always say no, we cannot do a GenAI solution. Well, that's because I always tell them it's the wrong thing to ask, because... I
love this. Sorry, I'm still laughing now, but I love it.
Because that's like, no, because that's the wrong question to ask. It's like, okay, if you ask me can you help us solve some of the problems we have, then I can say yes, and we can go and look at the processes, the problems. Do you need automation? Do you need dashboarding? Do you need whatever?
Do you have a good business case?
Exactly. Or do you even have value in this, right?
Yes.
Exactly, like effort, impact, all this analysis.
No, this will not take 2 hours. So do you have money for paying for,
exactly
half a year
right. And then we can make a roadmap and find out, okay, these are the use cases that will actually create money and value. And sometimes we just do boring stuff like getting data in order and dashboarding and so on. But in the end of the case, you want to you wanna create value. You don't want to use advanced tech, right? You want to create value.
But are you also telling them how much it means that their own involvement and how any solution would require some kind of human oversight and that whole testing side?
Yes.
Are you educating people on that?
Exactly right, because we take it very seriously as well to educate everyone about. I mean, okay, we have this new technology, but first of all, we need to be focused on our actual problems. And secondly, what are the issues with what we talked about, hallucination, bias, because of course we know how the world works. I mean, if you don't control or educate people, you're just going to get wowed by all the solutions out there. And then they're not going to ask the right questions, because then whatever, some company come and say, hey, we can do this chatbot for you and it's going to solve all your problems and all that. And if you don't know about the technology, you don't even know what to ask them. I mean, what about?
No, but it's the worst thing.
It
is the worst thing in the whole world. Now, I'm a consultant also, so selling these AI solutions to do. And then I was like, but some other one said someone said we could just do this in half a day with Copilot. No, and you really,
exactly.
You can't. Another word about Copilot, you can do lots of things with Copilot, but the whole thing we've discussed today around the testing and the setup, the purposely inhibited design, right? It means that it doesn't matter how quickly you can spin up something that looks like it.
Yeah.
Because you have to validate that it actually is it. Right?
Exactly right. So, I mean, the worst thing is not doing nothing. The worst thing is doing something incorrectly. So
that's very un-Silicon Valley of you to say.
Yeah, I mean, the best thing is, of course, to do things the proper way, right? But if you make an chatbot, you haven't thought about hallucinations and how it could potentially impact the business negatively, and what is the actual business rate, because the business rate is very low. But the cost of it making a wrong output is very high, and then you can actually end up having negative value.
Yeah, but the whole I think it was I read this Careless People, half of it, and then I don't know, I got sour. It started being the same. But I think in their office, Meta, Facebook back then had move fast and break things. It was said everywhere on the walls, right? So what you're saying is you definitely do not have that on your walls where you work at Novo.
So that depends where you are, because we do believe in the fail fast methodology. Like, if we actually have a good use case, but that's where you have the experts involved from our side to kind of make sure that we are in a controlled environment where we actually test out things, find out where it breaks, and find out if it solved the issue, and then move on with it.
Yeah, but how much is that of a project?
How much?
How much in that part? The fail fast thing. That's like the 5%.
Yeah, that's the 5%. Test, right? Yeah, because
stuff, right?
Depending on the project, like what we call a hackathon or data to wisdom sprint, it's like 2 to 4 weeks, right?
Yeah.
Where you just hack something together, you see if it works, and then if it doesn't work, then you kind of,
So the rest of the problem, the project is like any machine learning model.
Yeah, it's a lot about giving it in the hand of the users, gathering user feedback, building, pipelines for validation and stuff like that. That's and scaling and all that.
So I want to ask you, now we've spoken a lot about some of the limitations, but also some of the value. I think actually it's very balanced, but it's also very realistic. I like that. I really love that, because it's about, there's tons of things we can do, but we also need to make sure that we do it in a way where we don't make more errors than we had before. But what has actually surprised you the most? You were on this technology immediately, right? And that's also, I think, why you won this award, because you were quick to move and do things, right? Get something out there, living 40,000 employees in Novo, then substantial, right? Important stuff, right? But what surprised you over the last couple of years? Someone like you, the market response or the technology. Were you surprised by ChatGPT when it came out? Did you know about it before, or are you surprised about how people are talking about it? What is actually the most?
Yeah. So, I was surprised of how fast the whole GenAI revolution actually happened, because I have played around with the old language models, and they were kind of fun and cute, and you could have a little conversation, and sometimes it will be weird and sometimes it will be reasonable. You never knew.
No.
And then you were like, okay, I can't really use this for anything useful in the company. It was just fun to play with. But then there was the tipping point, I said November 2022, where OpenAI just released a model that just got it right. It was not perfect, but everybody could see there was value in it, and that just changed the whole the world so much. And they made it public, which was in a way very a genius move, but also maybe also a very risky move, because we don't even know how this is going to impact humanity in the next 10 years, or our kids or anything like that.
No.
But that's like, yeah, and I never seen that before. That we always been like, from an AI center of excellence, for example, we always been pushing to the organization like, okay, this is AI, you should use AI for somebody, you should think about AI, you should think about upscaling. Now it's the opposite. Everybody comes to us and wants to do AI.
Yeah.
Because it's been, and that's just surprised me a lot. And another thing that has surprised me was like, after ChatGPT came out, then of course there have been this race with Google, with the OpenAI and all that. And it's all been about creating, bigger models, more data, bigger models, right? And then it was just so interesting to see, for example, DeepSeek coming out. Like much smaller model, like much less smaller team, resources, and almost same performance, right? And it was like, yeah, that was just so surprising to see, like that they were just fighting to get the biggest and the most data and most training cost and all that was just skyrocketing. And then these other models comes out that is actually not as good, but I mean they are pretty impressive.
But we saw that GPT-5 didn't come, right? So obviously this would commoditize.
Yeah.
Everyone could do it, right? The GPT-4 size, okay, we can do that, of course, right? Now that's old news, right?
Yeah, I don't know if GPT-5 will come out at some point. Now they like to have all these, they go from 4 to 4.5 to 4.1.
Exactly. And O1 and 4 O, what does the O mean if it's in front or after, what's going on?
But that is what surprised me. Like,
do you test those? By the way? Are you surprised by now there's an O3? Oh, that's so cool. Are you like whoa about that? Or do you test the new models? Are you and maybe I can just say for myself, I'm bored with it. I don't do it.
Yeah. So of course, many of the projects out there, we do have these test data sets, and we can play around and try. Okay, there's a new model. Does it actually improve performance? Right? Okay, that's cool, right? And then of course we are looking a lot on also just the public benchmarking data sets to see like if something is better for a certain topic, right? For example, if a new model comes out and is way better in coding, right? Then we need to think about, should we make that kind of the go-to tool in that, right? So we are always monitoring it, and we always making sure that we use the best model for the best purpose. And I'm not bored of it yet, but
no,
I don't know. But it is happening a lot, right? And sometimes.
Are you testing DeepSeek, Le Chat from France, right? And Mistral. Are you testing Gemini? Are you testing Anthropics? Are you testing all of OpenAI's models? Are you testing the smaller models? Are you?
Yeah, so we test the ones that make sense, the ones that are actually based on, for example, public benchmarking, looks to be outperforming some of the other models, right? And because we have the AI marketplace, which means we basically have a common API layer to all the models on Azure, AWS. So it's actually super easy to do that. Just in the API call, just change the model name, and then you can. So we have a set up for that to be quite easy, right?
But you're not sitting there, are you?
Sometimes if a new model comes out and I'm like, oh, this one seems to be quite performance for this kind of purpose, then I will go back to an old project and try to run it and see, like, can we actually see it as well? That it's going up from whatever 90% to 92% or something like that. And then, well, if it actually does increase the accuracy, then I will just change the model.
But is this something that everyone should know about? Do you think, or is this something that people like you should know about? Is this something that every C-level out there should be thinking about now? Gemini did something new. I think you should always revisit what you have done before, right? Because sometimes you have models running in production that you built 2 years ago. But what I mean is that the C-level who just buys the project, right? The CFO or CEO or something like that. Should he also look at what Gemini or Google is doing right now, or Anthropic is doing?
No, I think that's more like if you have a center of excellence or something like that, the data science teams, they will, because I think from that level, it doesn't really matter what model it is, right? You just want to see what it can do, what's the value, right? Also, I mean, you would never tell that level, like if you use XGBoost or whatever model. Maybe
we did that with GPT-4 was
matter.
like super interesting, and they need to know about that because that was a big leap as well, right? And all those big leaps, or,
Oh, you mean the big leaps?
Yeah, and then are we doing big leaps? Are we doing incremental? Is it still interesting for them to know? Is it too flooded a market? I think a lot of people are having difficulty keeping their attention on it, right?
But you're right. For example, I mean, 3.5, they had to know that there was a new field emerging, right? But I think now the field has been established, and often when we see new models, it's just a question about the accuracy increasing, whatever, from 90 to 92% or something like that.
So now it's a tool in the toolbox.
Now it's an established tool in the toolbox, I would say, also for upper management. So then it's up to us just to. This is like when you do a machine learning project, right? You pick the right model for the problem. If it's a linear regression or if it's a XGBoost or a neural network, now it's just models have just different names now.
So it's not the entire toolbox. I know you said previously it's not. Just to make sure. Everyone might think that AI could be the entire toolbox, but you don't think it is, do you?
What do you mean AI is the entire toolbox?
No, all of the tools in the toolbox. AI can do everything.
No, I don't think it can. I don't think it should. I think I think the AI is a tool, but there are also other tools in the toolbox for different problems. So,
Peter, I've loved having you on the show today. This has been really brilliant. I think we've covered a lot of ground. You've said a lot of things. You said a lot of things also. I know they're not even controversial, but the weird thing is that they are controversial in some cases in an AI world where everyone's saying tons of super hyped up stuff, right? About immense capabilities and how easy it is and how we don't need developers. So you said things that shouldn't be controversial, but there still is in some places, right?
And that is interesting, like, because a lot of people have a lot of big words around it, but then when we look at it, it's actually limited how many use cases we have out there that is bringing in the big box, you know?
Yeah.
We have some.
Yeah.
But when you think about all the thousands of projects going on in all the companies everywhere, it's only like often it's just a handful that actually is showing immense value. The rest is like interesting and cool, but then you put it out there in production and no one uses it. Or
but I think that's coming. Don't think that's coming.
I think that's coming over time, yeah.
Because it takes time to build these agentic system setups,
yes.
right?
I think it's coming over time, but we don't actually know exactly how the adoption is going to be of these technologies and what problems you're going to face. But it is a promising technology, but we also sometimes have to be realistic and say, like, we haven't actually proven the huge value yet. I think the biggest value we have proven is basically giving large language model in the hand of everyone so they can use it for their own purposes. And then, of course, we have some systems that bring some value here and there, but there's still a lot to be shown. And I think it will be coming, right? But we also need to be realistic that it's not just going to change everything in a year. That will take time.
I have a final question for you, Peter, if you're ready for that one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the end to the episode.
Okay.
Are you ready for that question?
I'm ready.
So, Peter, what is the only constant?
When I look at it, I think the only constant is change and adoption. So that's things that we can actually not avoid. There will always be changes and people will always adopt technology. And the only thing we can sometimes try to impact is if we're going to adopt it in a good and responsible way. We talked about the case, for example, there were many cases back then, but for example with Samsung, right? I mean, there was a change in technology and there was adoption automatically. The developers started using it on the confidential code bases and so on. And so there's a clear example of there was a change, there was adoption, it's a constant, we cannot change, it's going to happen. You cannot just sit back and not do anything because then it will just happen without your control. So and then of course what they did was that they just blocked it, right? And then they couldn't use it anymore. That was their way of responding to that. So I think that's what we need to think about is like, how do we actually adopt the right way? So that's especially nowadays when the change happens much more quickly, we often have to be very proactive in assessing technologies, in trying to predict what is going to happen next, so we can make sure that the adoption is happening in a way that we are able to control ourselves.
So the only constant is adoption and change, obviously, but also our ability to control ourselves. That we need to constantly try to control ourselves.
Exactly right, because the change will happen. No matter what you do, people will start adopting technology. If you don't do anything, they will do it their own ways, for their own purposes, and it will be a huge mess. And so what you can do is you can try to impact the way that we adopt the technology, but you have to be very proactive and very fast. And one of the problems we have is that we are used to change being slower, and that goes everywhere. It goes from like making legal changes to organizational changes and so on. Everything is built up around changes being much slower than they are nowadays. So we need to be able to build companies, to build teams that are able to adopt more quickly. We need to make sure that we have a mindset everywhere in the organization around, we need to keep an eye on what's happening out there. We need to be able to change the ways we are working and all that.
And be maybe, as I said a couple of times, purposefully inhibited in how we respond to change and adopt technologies.
Exactly right, and also to be realistic, right? I mean, you can also impact the adoption of technology in a way where you're over encouraging, and then you end up having a company with 1,000 different GenAI projects, all very ambitious, but none of them actually creating value, none of them being aligned with anything.
And on that note, Peter, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for joining The Only Constant. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, it's been a pleasure to join, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for listening. If you liked this episode, share it with a friend or a colleague.